Hello and welcome to the English Hour. I'm Sophia, your host, and today we have an exciting discussion on how to improve English naturally and effectively. Joining me are two amazing guests who have both mastered English as a second language.
Hey Sophia, excited to be here.
Thanks for having us. I love talking about language learning, so this is going to be fun.
Absolutely. Learning English can feel overwhelming at times, but the right strategies can make the process much easier and even enjoyable. So, let's start with a simple question. Daniel, when you first started learning English, what was your biggest struggle?
I think my biggest struggle was confidence. I was so afraid of making mistakes that I avoided speaking altogether. I kept waiting until I felt, but that moment never came. Eventually, I realized that the only way to get better was to actually use the language, mistakes and all.
That's so relatable. I had the same fear when I started. I would read a lot, but when it came to speaking, I just froze. The turning point for me was when I stopped caring about being perfect and focused on making progress instead.
That's a huge mindset shift. A lot of people think they need to speak perfect before they can have a conversation, but in reality, making mistakes is part of the process. How did you push past that fear and start speaking more?
I started small. Instead of full conversations, I would practice short phrases or repeat what I heard in movies. I would even talk to myself in English, just to get used to forming sentences.
That's a great trick. I also used to shadow native speakers. I would listen to English podcasts and repeat what they were saying, trying to match their tone and pronunciation. It felt weird at first, but it helped me sound more natural over time.
Shadowing is such a powerful technique. It helps with pronunciation, rhythm, and even confidence. Speaking of, Connie learners struggle with thinking in their native language and then translating into English. Did you experience that?
Oh, definitely. It slowed me down a lot because I was always second-guessing my sentences. The moment I started thinking directly in English, everything became easier.
That was a game changer for me too. At first, I would describe simple things in my head like, I need to buy some vegetables, or I am going to the store. Later, it became automatic, and I no longer needed to translate.
That's such a practical tip. Thinking in English helps remove the extra step of translation, making speech more natural and fluent. Another question. Many learners say they understand English when they listen or read, but struggle when they have to speak. What do you think causes that gap?
It's because speaking requires a different skill set. Listening is passive, but speaking is active. If you only consume English without using it, your brain doesn't get enough practice forming sentences quickly.
That's so true. It's like watching someone play the piano and expecting to know how to play just by observing. You actually have to sit down and practice yourself.
I love that analogy. You can't become fluent by just watching and listening. You need to actively engage with the language. What would you recommend for someone who wants to start practicing but doesn't have native speakers around them?
Talking to yourself is a great way to start. Narrate what you're doing, describe what you see around you, or even record yourself speaking and listen back to see where you can improve.
And if you want interaction, there are so many online language exchange platforms where you can practice with other learners or native speakers. You don't need to be in an English-speaking country to immerse yourself in English.
That's a great point. Immersion isn't about location. It's about mindset. You can surround yourself with English by changing your phone settings, thinking in English, and making it a part of your daily life.
Exactly. The people who improve the fastest are the ones who don't just study English, but actually live in it.
Yes, the goal isn't to learn English, it's to use English. That's when real progress happens.
I love that. Learning a language is about making it part of your routine, not just something you study once in a while. There's so much more to talk about, so let's dive even deeper into some practical ways to stay motivated and make learning English feel effortless. Motivation is a big challenge for many learners. At the start, everything feels exciting, but after a while, progress can seem slow, and some people give up. Daniel, how did you stay motivated when learning English?
That's a great question. For me, the key was making English a part of my everyday life rather than treating it like a school subject. I watched movies in English, listened to music, and even followed English-speaking YouTubers. The more I enjoyed the process, the less it felt like studying.
I agree. When I started, I used to force myself to study grammar rules, and it felt boring. But when I switched to watching interviews, reading books I actually liked, and playing video games in English, everything changed. I was having fun while improving.
That's such a powerful approach. Learning doesn't have to feel like a chore. It should be something enjoyable and engaging. But what about those times when you feel stuck? What did you do when you felt like your progress had stopped?
Oh, I definitely experienced that. There were times when I felt like I wasn't improving at all. But looking back, I realized that progress isn't always visible. I kept practicing even when I felt stuck. And suddenly, things started clicking again.
That's a really important point. Just because you don't notice progress doesn't mean it's not happening. When I hit a plateau, I changed my routine. I would challenge myself by trying new things, like switching to harder books or having longer conversations.
That's such a good strategy. Sometimes switching up your learning methods can push you forward again. Now let's talk about pronunciation. A lot of learners say they struggle with sounding natural. How did you work on yours?
I used to record myself speaking and compare it to native speakers. It was uncomfortable at first, but it helped me hear where I needed to improve.
I did the same. I also mimicked native speakers while watching TV shows. I would pause, repeat after them, and try to match their tone and rhythm.
That's amazing. I think pronunciation improves when you listen closely and try to copy real speech patterns. Another thing people struggle with is expanding their vocabulary. Any tips on how to learn new words effectively?
Instead of memorizing long word lists, I learned words in context. If I heard a new word in a movie, I would look it up and try to use it in a sentence. That made it easier to remember.
I love flashcards, but I make sure to learn words and phrases rather than alone. For example, instead of just learning commitment, I would remember make a commitment or long-term commitment. It helps me use the word naturally.
That's a smart way to do it. Learning phrases instead of single words makes it easier to speak fluently. Speaking of fluency, some learners feel like they hesitate too much when talking. How can they fix that?
One trick is to practice speaking without worrying about grammar. Just try to keep going, even if you make mistakes. Over time, your brain gets faster at forming sentences.
I also used to time myself. I would pick a topic and speak for 1 minute without stopping. At first, I hesitated a lot, but with practice, I got much faster and more confident.
That's such a great exercise. Fluency is about speed and confidence, not just correctness. And speaking of confidence, some people feel nervous when talking to native speakers. How did you overcome that fear?
I reminded myself that native speakers don't expect me to be perfect. They appreciate the effort, and most of the time, they're supportive and patient.
Exactly. I also focused on communication instead of perfection. The goal is to be understood, not to speak without mistakes.
That's such a great mindset. The fear of making mistakes holds many people back, but mistakes are actually signs of progress. Let's go even deeper into some advanced strategies for taking English skills to the next level. Now that we've covered the basics, let's take this discussion to the next level. A lot of learners reach a point where they can hold conversations, but they struggle with sounding natural, understanding fast speech, or expressing complex thoughts. Daniel, what do you think is the difference between someone who speaks English well and someone who speaks like a native?
That's an interesting question. I think the biggest difference is rhythm and natural phrasing. Many learners focus on individual words, but natives use connected speech, contractions, and informal expressions that make their speech flow smoothly.
For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" a native speaker might say, "What you doing?" Or instead, "I gotta go," they'll say, "I gotta go." These small changes make a huge difference in how natural you sound.
That's a great point. Connected speech is something learners often overlook. Let's talk about that in more detail. Daniel, how did you train yourself to recognize and use these patterns?
I started by listening very carefully. At first, when I heard native speakers, I thought they were speaking too fast. But then I realized they every word clearly. They were linking words together. So I started focusing on those connections and practicing them myself.
I had the same experience. I used to slow down audio clips and repeat them, trying to match the way native speakers blended words together. It felt strange at first, but over time, I started doing it naturally.
That's such a smart way to learn. If you listen closely, you'll notice that native speakers don't say words separately. They flow together. Let's try an example. Instead of, "Do you want to go?" a native speaker might say, "Do ya want to go?" How can learners practice these changes?
One of the best ways is shadowing. You listen to a sentence, pause, and repeat it exactly as the native speaker says it. Try to copy their tone, rhythm, and pronunciation as closely as possible.
Yes, and another tip is to watch movies or TV shows with subtitles, but instead of reading them, focus on how words sound. Then, practice saying the lines the same way.
I love that. Shadowing and listening carefully to real speech can help learners sound much more fluent. Now, let's talk about another challenge: understanding native speakers when they talk fast. Some learners say that even though they know the words, they struggle to catch everything in conversations. Why do you think that happens?
It's because real conversations are different from the English you see in textbooks. In real life, people use slang idioms and unfinished sentences. Plus, they don't always pronounce every word clearly.
Yes, and another thing is that learners often try to understand every single word, but that's not how listening works in real life. Native speakers don't hear every word either. They listen for meaning.
That's an interesting point. Many learners try to translate everything in their head, which slows them down. How can they improve their listening skills to keep up with fast speech?
First, expose yourself to natural speech as much as possible. Instead of only listening to slow, clear English, try podcasts, interviews, and real conversations. Even if you don't understand everything, your brain will start getting used to the sounds.
Another trick is to focus on keywords instead of every single word. For example, if someone says, "Hey, you want to grab a coffee later?" you don't need to hear every word. If you catch grab, coffee, and later, you can still understand the meaning.
That's a great technique. Instead of stressing about every word, just listen for the main ideas. Now, let's shift to another big topic: expressing complex thoughts. A lot of learners feel confident with everyday conversation, but struggle to explain opinions or ideas in depth. How did you get better at that?
At first, I kept my sentences simple because I was afraid of making mistakes. But later, I realized that to express more advanced ideas, I needed to practice speaking about different topics.
Same here. I started discussing news articles, debating topics, and even journaling in English. The more I tried to express myself, the better I got.
That's a great exercise. Writing down your thoughts in English forces you to organize them, which helps when speaking. What about vocabulary? Some learners say they feel limited in how they express themselves because they don't know enough words. Any advice?
Instead of memorizing long word lists, I focused on learning words through real conversations. When I heard a new word, I wrote it down, looked up its meaning, and used it in a sentence right away.
And learning synonyms helped me a lot. If I didn't know a word, I found a simpler way to say it. For example, instead of frustrating, I could say really annoying. That way, I never got stuck in conversations.
That's a great way to avoid getting stuck. Expanding vocabulary is important, but knowing how to explain things in different ways is even more useful. There's so much more to cover. So let's keep going deeper into how to train your brain to think in English effortlessly. Thinking in English is something many learners struggle with. They can read, write, and even speak well, but their thoughts still form in their native language first. Then they translate, which slows everything down. Daniel, how did you train yourself to think directly in English?
At first, it was difficult because I was used to thinking in my native language. But I started forcing myself to describe things around me, English, throughout the day. For example, if I saw a car passing by, I would think, "That's a red car. It's driving fast." This helped me build the habit of forming sentences without translating.
That's a great technique. I also used a similar method. I started talking to myself in English, like when I was cooking or walking. I would narrate my actions in my head, saying things like, No, I'm chopping vegetables. I need to add some salt. It felt weird at first, but over time, my brain started processing English naturally.
That's really interesting. Instead of translating, you were training your brain to associate English words directly with thoughts and actions. I think a lot of learners don't realize that this is a skill they can develop. What about more advanced thinking? Like forming opinions or making decisions in English?
For me, it helped to read in English and then reflect on what I read without switching back to my native language. For example, if I read an art of technology, I'd ask myself, do I agree with this? Why or why not? This forced me to form thoughts in English rather than just understanding the words.
That's a great method. Another thing that helped me was practicing debates with myself. I would pick a random topic and argue both sides in English. For example, is social media good or bad? First, I'd argue for it, then against it. This improved my ability to express opinions naturally.
I love that idea. Debating with yourself forces you to think critically in English. Now, let's talk about another challenge: confidence. Many learners know a lot of English but hesitate to speak because they're afraid of making mistakes. How did you overcome that fear?
I used to be really self-conscious about my pronunciation and grammar. But then I realized that making mistakes is part of the learning process. So instead of avoiding conversations, I started focusing on communicating my message. Even if my grammar wasn't perfect, I kept talking.
Same here. One thing that helped me was speaking with non-native speakers first. I joined online communities where people were learning English, and we practiced together. Since everyone was learning, I felt less pressure. Then, as I got more comfortable, I started speaking with native speakers.
That's a great approach. Many learners wait until they feel ready, but the truth is, the only way to get ready is to start speaking. So, Daniel, what's one mindset shift that really helped you gain confidence?
I stopped trying to be perfect. I realized that even native speakers make mistakes, use fillers like koe, kum, and sometimes forget words. So instead of stressing about perfection, I focused on fluency and communication.
That's a really important mindset shift. I also stopped seeing mistakes as failures and started seeing them as learning opportunities. If I made a mistake, I corrected myself and moved on instead of feeling embarrassed.
That's a powerful lesson. Instead of fearing mistakes, learners should embrace them as part of growth. Now, let's take this even deeper. Once someone becomes fluent, how can they continue improving to sound even more natural and sophisticated?
One thing I did was expand my range of expressions. Instead of using basic sentences, I started incorporating idioms and phrasal verbs. For example, instead of saying, I'm very tired, I'd say I'm worn out but. This made my English sound more natural.
I also focused on intonation and emphasis. In English, the way you say something is just as important as the words you use. I practiced changing my tone to match emotions, like sounding excited, surprised, or serious. This made my speech more engaging.
That's such an important point. English isn't just about words. It's about how you deliver them. Speaking naturally involves using rhythm, stress, and even pauses. Let's talk about how learners can practice that.
One technique that really helped me was shadowing. I would listen to native speakers, whether in podcasts, interviews, or TV shows, and repeat what they say immediately, mimicking their tone, pace, and rhythm. It wasn't just about repeating the words, but capturing the way they spoke.
Shadowing is powerful. I did something similar but with movie scenes. I'd pick a short clip, listen carefully, then pause and try to say the lines exactly like the actor. It helped me understand natural speech patterns, contractions, and even informal expressions.
That's an amazing technique. It forces you to match the natural flow of English instead of reading mechanically. Also, many learners struggle with connected speech. How native speakers link words together. Did shadowing help with that?
Absolutely. For example, I used to say each word separately, like, what do you want? But after shadowing, I started hearing how native speakers say it. What do you want? Learning these natural reductions made my speech sound more fluid.
That's a big one. English isn't spoken like it's written. We say, like gonna instead of going to, or lim instead of let me. At first, I thought this was slang, but it's just how people naturally speak. Once I started using these forms, my speech became much smoother.
That's so true. Many learners focus only on textbook English, but real conversations are much more dynamic. Another thing that affects fluency is hesitation. Even advanced learners sometimes pause too much while thinking of the right words. How did you deal with that?
I practiced using filler phrases that sound natural. Instead of just pausing awkwardly, I'd say things like, "Well, let me think," or "That's an interesting question." It gave me a second to gather my thoughts without losing the flow of conversation.
That's a great trick. I also trained myself to keep speaking even if I didn't know the exact word. Instead of stopping, I'd describe what I meant. For example, if I forgot the word thermometer, I'd say, "It's the tool that measures temperature." This way, I kept the conversation going.
That's a fantastic skill. It's called circumlocution, explaining something when you don't know the exact word. Native speakers do it too. So, what's another key skill for advanced learners to sound more natural?
Storytelling. In real conversations, people don't just answer questions. They tell stories. I practiced sharing short personal experiences in English, making sure my sentences flowed naturally instead of sounding like a list of facts.
That's an excellent point. Storytelling makes conversations more engaging. I practiced by summarizing books or movies in my own words. At first, I struggled, but over time, I became much better at describing events smoothly.
Storytelling is such an essential skill. It makes people more engaging and helps them connect better. Plus, when you tell a story, you naturally use different tenses, descriptive words, and expressions. Let's go even deeper. How can learners improve their vocabulary beyond the basics?
I focused on learning words in context. Instead of memorizing long vocabulary lists, I'd read books or articles and pay attention to how words were actually used in sentences. This helped me remember them better.
That's a great strategy. I also kept a vocabulary journal, but instead of just writing down new words, I'd write full example sentences. And I made sure to use the new words in daily conversations, so they became part of my active vocabulary.
That's smart. Writing and using new words right away makes them stick. But what about advanced learners who already have a strong vocabulary? How can they make their English sound more sophisticated?
One thing that helped me was learning collocations, words that naturally go together. For example, instead of just saying big change, I learned to say dramatic change or significant improvement. This made my speech sound more natural.
Yes. Collocations are so important. Another trick I used was paying attention to how native speakers express ideas differently. For example, instead of saying, "I'm happy," learn to say, "I'm over the moon," or "I'm thrilled." Small changes like this made my English sound more refined.
That's a fantastic way to level up. English isn't just about knowing words. It's about knowing which words go together and how to express ideas naturally. Another important topic is listening comprehension. Many learners struggle to understand fast, native-level speech. How did you improve your listening skills?
I exposed myself to as much real English as possible. Instead of just listening to slow, clear recordings for learners, I listened to natural conversations, podcasts, and interviews. Even if I didn't understand everything at first, over time my brain adjusted.
That's a great tip. I also practiced active listening. Instead of just letting words go by, I'd focus on catching key ideas. I'd listen to a sentence, pause, and try to repeat what I heard. This helped me process spoken English much faster.
Active listening is such a powerful technique. A lot of learners listen passively, but engaging with the audio makes a huge difference. Another thing is pronunciation. Many learners understand English well, but struggle with speaking clearly. How did you improve your pronunciation?
I focused on individual sounds that were difficult for me. I would record myself saying tricky words, compare it to native speakers, and adjust my pronunciation until it sounded right.
I did the same. I also practiced minimal pairs, words that sound similar but have different pronunciations, like ship and sheep or and beat. This helped me hear and pronounce the differences correctly.
That's a great technique. Pronunciation isn't just about individual words, but also about stress and rhythm. English has a natural flow, and getting that right makes speech sound much clearer. Now, let's move on to another important skill.
Another thing that really helped me was focusing on intonation and stress. English isn't spoken in a flat tone. Certain words are emphasized to convey meaning. For example, in the sentence, "I never said she stole my money," the meaning changes depending on which word you stress.
That's so true. Intonation plays a huge role in expressing emotions. If you say something in a monotone, it can sound robotic. But if you stress the right words and vary your pitch, it sounds natural and engaging.
Exactly. Native speakers naturally change their tone depending on the situation. That's why just knowing vocabulary and grammar isn't enough. How you say something is just as important as what you say. Let's talk about confidence. Many learners struggle with speaking because they're afraid of making mistakes. How did you overcome that?
I stopped aiming for perfection. At first, I was afraid of saying something wrong, but then I realized that native speakers make mistakes too. The key is to keep speaking and not let small errors stop you.
That's such an important mindset. I also reminded myself that communication is the goal, not perfection. If people understand me, that's what matters. And the more I spoke, the more natural I became.
That's a great point. Fear of mistakes often holds learners back more than their actual language skills. But once you accept that making mistakes is part of the process, you improve much faster. What about writing? Many learners focus on speaking, but struggle to express themselves clearly in writing.
Writing helps reinforce everything you learn. When I was improving my English, I kept a daily journal. I'd write about my day, my thoughts, or anything interesting I learned. It helped me organize my ideas and practice new vocabulary.
I did something similar. I also practiced writing emails and social media posts in English. Since writing gives you more time to think, it's a great way to experiment with new words and sentence structures.
That's a great tip. Writing allows you to slow down and really focus on accuracy. And when you write regularly, you start to notice common mistakes and learn how to fix them. Now, let's talk about another challenge: thinking in English. Many learners still think in their native language and translate in their heads. How did you start thinking in English?
I immersed myself as much as possible. I changed my phone settings to English, thought about my daily plans in English, and even talked to myself when I was alone. Over time, my brain just got used to it.
That worked for me too. I also described things around me in English, like, "That's a tall building," or "The sky is cloudy today." It was a small habit, but it trained my brain to use English naturally.
That's such a powerful strategy. The more you expose yourself to English, the more your brain adapts. Eventually, it becomes second nature. Let's talk about reading. Many learners read a lot but struggle to remember new words or understand complex texts. How did you improve your reading skills?
I started with materials I actually enjoyed. If I forced myself to read something boring, I wouldn't remember much. But when I read books, blogs, or news articles on topics I liked, I stayed engaged and absorbed more.
I did the same. I also made it a habit to guess the meaning of new words from context instead of immediately checking the dictionary. It helped me develop a natural understanding of vocabulary.
That's a great technique. Guessing from context builds reading fluency and helps you remember words better. Speaking of fluency, let's talk about conversation skills. Many learners say they understand English but struggle to keep a conversation going. What helped you with that?
I practiced small talk and common conversation starters. For example, instead of just saying, "he," I'd say, "Hey, how's your day going?" Simple things like that kept conversations flowing.
That's a great point. I also practiced asking follow-up questions. If someone said, "I just got back from a trip," I wouldn't just say, "Cool." I'd ask, "Oh, where did you go? How was it?" That kept conversations interesting.
That's such an important skill. Many learners focus on answering questions but forget to ask them. Good conversations are a two-way street. Another key skill is humor. Did you ever try using humor in English?
At first, I was nervous because humor doesn't always translate well. But I started by learning common jokes and puns in English. Eventually, I got comfortable making my own jokes.
Me too. I also watched a lot of comedy shows and stand-up performances to understand how humor works in English. It helped me become more natural in conversations.
Humor is a great way to connect with people. It shows confidence and makes conversations more enjoyable. Now, let's move on to another important skill. Listening. A lot of learners say they can understand English when they read it, but spoken English feels too fast. What helped you improve your listening skills?
At first, I struggled a lot with fast speech. But instead of focusing on every single word, I trained my ears to catch the main ideas. I started with slow podcasts, then moved on to regular, speed conversations. Over time, my brain adapted.
I did something similar. I also used subtitles at first when watching movies or shows, but eventually I switched them off and just relied on context. It was hard in the beginning, but it really improved my listening skills.
That's a great technique. Sometimes learners think they need to understand every word, but real-life conversations aren't like that. It's more about grasping the overall message. What about accents? English is spoken with so many different accents. How did you train your ears to understand them?
I exposed myself to different accents as much as possible. I listened to British podcasts, American TV shows, Australian YouTubers, anything that gave me variety. At first, some accents were harder to understand, but with practice, it got easier.
That's so true. I also paid attention to pronunciation patterns. For example, in American English, words often get linked together, like, what do you want? Sounding like, what day I want. Recognizing these patterns helped me understand spoken English better.
That's a great strategy. English pronunciation can be tricky because native speakers don't always pronounce words clearly. They blend sounds together. But once you get used to it, listening becomes much easier. Now, let's talk about a challenge many learners face: expanding vocabulary. How did you build your vocabulary effectively?
I made learning new words fun. Instead of just memorizing word lists, I played word games, used flashcards, and even kept a word of the day notebook. Whenever I learned a new word, I tried using it in real-life situations.
I did something similar. I also learned words in context. For example, instead of just memorizing fascinating as a word, I'd see how it was used in a sentence. Like, this book is fascinating. That way I remembered it better.
That's such an important tip. Learning words in context is way more effective than memorizing them in isolation. Another great way to expand vocabulary is by learning phrases instead of single words. Did you use that approach?
Yes. Instead of learning words one by one, I learned entire phrases like take it for granted or go the extra mile. That made my speech sound more natural, because native speakers use phrases all the time.
I agree. Learning collocations, words that naturally go together, help me a lot. For example, we say make a decision, not do a decision. Picking up on those patterns made my English smoother.
That's a great point. Learning how words naturally fit together makes speaking and writing much more fluent. Now, let's talk about motivation. Learning a language takes time, and many learners feel frustrated when they don't see quick results. How did you stay motivated?
I reminded myself why I was learning English. Whether it was for travel, work, or personal growth, having a strong reason kept me going. I also set small, achievable goals, like learning 5 new words a day or having a 5-minute conversation in English.
That's such a great mindset. I also surrounded myself with English as much as possible, so it never felt like studying. I listened to English music, followed English speaking influencers, and even changed my social media language settings to English.
That's a smart approach. The more English becomes a part of your daily life, the more natural it feels. Now let's discuss confidence again, because many learners understand English well, but still hesitate to speak. What advice would you give to someone who is afraid to speak English?
My advice is simple. Just start speaking. Even if it's just a few sentences a day, the more you practice, the easier it gets. Find a language partner, join an English speaking group, or even practice in front of a mirror.
That's great advice. I'd also say, don't be too hard on yourself. Mistakes are a natural part of learning. The important thing is to communicate. If people understand you, that's what matters most.
Absolutely. Confidence comes with practice. The more you speak, the more natural it becomes. Now, let's move on to another common challenge: thinking in English. Many learners translate sentences in their heads before speaking, which slows them down. How did you train yourself to think directly in English?
It took time, but I started by surrounding myself with English every day. I described things around me in English, even when I was alone. For example, if I saw a beautiful sunset, I'd think, "The sky looks amazing right now." This helped me form sentences naturally without translating.
That's a great strategy. I did something similar. I also started having internal dialogues in English. If I was planning my day, I'd think, okay, first I'll go to the store, then I'll meet my friend for coffee. This habit made English feel more natural to me.
That's a really effective way to train your brain. Instead of waiting until you're in a conversation, you practice thinking in English all the time. Did you also use writing as a way to improve fluency?
Definitely. I kept a journal in English and wrote a few sentences about my day. At first, I made mistakes, but over time, my sentences became more natural. Writing helped me remember words and structures better.
Same here. I also wrote short messages to myself, like to-do lists or notes on my phone in English. It didn't feel like studying, but it helped me think faster in English.
That's a great tip. Even small habits like writing notes or texting in English can make a big difference. Now, let's talk about pronunciation. Many learners feel self-conscious about their pronunciation. How did you work on improving yours?
I listened to native speakers carefully and repeated what they said. Shadowing was a great technique. I'd play a short sentence from a podcast or video and immediately repeat it, trying to match the pronunciation and rhythm.
I did the same thing. I also recorded myself speaking and compared it to native speakers. At first, it was a bit uncomfortable listening to my own voice, but it helped me identify areas I needed to improve.
That's a smart approach. Recording yourself is a great way to track progress. Also, paying attention to stress and intonation makes a big difference. Did you focus on that too?
Yes, English has a rhythm, and stressing the right words makes speech sound more natural. For example, instead of saying every word equally, I practice stressing keywords, like I didn't say he stole the money. Changing the stress changes the meaning.
That's so true. I also paid attention to connected speech, how words blend together. Like how, what do you mean? Sounds more like, what do you mean? Recognizing these patterns helped me understand spoken English better.
That's a great insight. English pronunciation isn't just about individual sounds. It's about how words flow together. Now, let's touch on another challenge: understanding fast speakers. Many learners say native speakers talk too fast. How did you train your ears to keep up?
I started with slower content, like audiobooks or beginner podcasts. Then, I gradually moved to faster content. I also listened multiple times. First, without subtitles. If I didn't understand something, I listened again while reading the transcript.
That's exactly what I did. I also used the slow down feature on YouTube and podcasts. I'd listen at 0.75 speed first, then at normal speed. This helped my ears adjust.
That's a smart method. Listening multiple times and adjusting speed can really help with comprehension. Now, let's talk about speaking naturally. Many learners worry that their English sounds too robotic or unnatural. How did you develop a more natural speaking style?
I imitated native speakers. I'd listen to how they spoke in movies or interviews, then try to copy their tone and expressions. Learning common phrases and idioms also helped me sound more fluent.
That's a great point. I also practiced speaking with emotion instead of just saying words. I focused on how native speakers express excitement, surprise, or curiosity. It made my speech more engaging.
That's a key tip. Communication isn't just about words. It's about tone expression too. Another important topic we should address is grammar. Many learners worry about making grammatical mistakes, but they're often afraid to speak because of it. How did you balance grammar accuracy with fluency in your learning?
Great question, Sophia. For me, I focused on fluency first. I didn't worry too much about making mistakes when I was speaking because I knew I'd improve over time. Afterward, I worked on grammar through reading and writing. I tried to understand the structure, but I didn't let it hold me back from communicating.
I agree with Daniel. I think grammar is important, but it shouldn't stop you from speaking. I would make mistakes, but I learned to correct them over time. I also found that grammar became more intuitive as I kept using English. The more I spoke and wrote, the more natural the rules became.
That's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in grammar perfection, but communication is the main goal. Once you build fluency, grammar will fall into place more naturally. Now, let's talk about one more area: reading. Many learners wonder how to read effectively in English, especially when they're faced with long or complex texts. What strategies worked for you?
For me, I started with easier books. Things I was genuinely interested in, like comics or short stories. I also didn't force myself to understand every word. If I didn't know a word, I tried to guess its meaning from the context, and I'd look it up later if I still didn't understand it.
That's a great way to start, something similar. I also read articles online and focused on understanding the main ideas rather than trying to translate every word. I made reading more enjoyable by choosing topics I was passionate about, like technology and science, so I was more motivated.
I love those strategies. Finding something you enjoy reading makes a huge difference in staying motivated. It's also important to read regularly, even if it's just a few minutes a day. The more you read, the more vocabulary and grammar structures you'll naturally pick up.
Absolutely. I also recommend reading aloud from time to time. It helped me improve both my pronunciation and my understanding of sentence structure. It's also a great way to practice speaking in a more natural rhythm.
Yes, reading aloud was key for me too. I think a lot of learners forget how important reading aloud is for practicing pronunciation and fluency. It's like speaking practice without the pressure of a conversation.
That's such an underrated tip. Reading aloud really helps connect what you read to how you speak. Now, I want to touch on the idea of language immersion. This is one of the most effective ways to learn. How did you immerse yourself in English outside of your study sessions?
I made sure to surround myself with English as much as possible. I set my phone, computer, and social media accounts to English. I also followed English-speaking content creators and participated in online forums where people spoke in English. Even small changes like lish music or podcasts during my daily activities helped me stay immersed.
I did something similar. I made a habit of switching my TV shows, news channels, and even my video games to English. It wasn't always easy at first, but it made English a part of my everyday life. The more exposure I got, the easier it became.
That's excellent advice. Immersion doesn't mean moving to an English-speaking country. You can create an immersive environment from home with a little creativity. The goal is to make English a natural part of your daily routine. Now, I have one final question for both of you. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting their English learning journey?
I'd say don't be afraid to make mistakes. The beginning is always the hardest part, but you'll improve with practice. Set small, achievable goals and celebrate your progress, no matter how small it seems.
I would say the same. Focus on enjoying the process. Language learning should be fun, not stressful. Keep experimenting with different resources, apps, podcasts, books, videos, and find what works best for you.
That's wonderful advice from both of you. Language learning is a journey, and while it might be challenging at times, every step you take gets you closer to your goal. Before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to dive into: staying motivated over the long term. Learning a language can be a marathon, not a sprint. What kept you both motivated to continue improving your English?
For me, it was setting clear, realistic goals. I would challenge myself to read one English book a month or write a 500-word essay every week. Even if I didn't meet the goal exactly, it helped me stay on track and made me feel like I was progressing.
That's a great approach. For me, it was about connecting English to my passions. I realized that I could enjoy my hobbies, like gaming and traveling, in English. Watching gaming tutorials in English or planning trips in English made me excited to continue learning. It felt more like fun than study.
Connecting language learning to your interests is such a powerful strategy. When English becomes part of something you already enjoy, it doesn't feel like work at all. Have you found any other habits that helped you stay engaged?
Yes, I think socializing in English helped a lot. I joined online communities where I could chat with people in English about topics I was passionate about. Having real conversations with native speakers or fellow learners made me feel connected to a larger community.
That's such a good point. For me, I also tried to make learning a routine. Even if I didn't have a lot of time in one day, I'd set aside a few minutes to practice. Whether it was listening to a podcast or learning a new phrase, those small daily habits added up over time.
Those are excellent tips. Consistency and community can keep you moving forward even when things feel tough. Now, let's dive into something that I think many learners wonder about, whether they should focus more on British or American English. What do you both think?
Personally, I didn't worry too much about the differences at first. I just wanted to get comfortable with the language. Over time, I naturally picked up more American English, because a lot of the media I consumed was from the US. But honestly, I think it's about personal preference. If you're more into British culture or content, then British English might feel more natural for you.
I agree. I think the key is to be aware of the differences between the two. Things like spelling, vocabulary, or some grammar rules, but don't stress about it. In the end, English speakers will understand you no matter which variant you use. It's more about fluency and communication.
Exactly. At the end of the day, both British and American English are valid. You can choose whichever suits your preferences and goals. The most important thing is to stay consistent with your practice.
And, there's a third option using international English. A lot of people, especially in business or travel, use a version of English that's a mix of both British and American elements. It's great for global communication because it's more neutral.
That's a great point, Daniel. International English is becoming more common, and it focuses more on clear communication than on regional differences.
Absolutely. English is such a global language, and the main thing is being understood. Now, before we end, let's leave our listeners with one last piece of advice. What's the best tip you can give to someone trying to master English?
My tip would be to enjoy the journey. Don't just focus on the destination. Celebrate your progress, however small it may seem, and remember that language learning is an adventure.
I would say, don't be afraid to step outside of your comfort zone. Practice speaking as much as possible, even if you feel nervous. The more you push yourself, the more confident you'll become.
Such great advice. The journey of learning a language is filled with ups and downs, but it's always worth it. Before we conclude, I want to dive into one more important aspect of learning English: staying consistent. A lot of learners struggle with maintaining consistency, especially when they don't see immediate results. How did you guys manage to stay consistent?
That's a really good question, Sophia. For me, it was about developing a daily habit, even if it was small. I made English a part of my routine. Whether it was listening to a podcast on my commute, reading for 15 minutes before bed, or practicing speaking in front of the mirror, I didn't wait for the perfect time. I just found small pockets of time throughout the day.
I completely agree. It's all about making it a habit. I created a schedule for myself where every day I would learn a few new words, watch a short video in English, or write a paragraph. The key was that I didn't let any day go by without some exposure to the language.
That's great advice. Creating small, consistent habits really adds up over time. What about those moments when motivation dips? It's natural for enthusiasm to fade a bit. How did you both stay motivated even when things got tough?
There were definitely days when I felt frustrated or didn't feel like practicing. On those days, I would focus on progress, not perfection. I'd remind myself that learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. Even if I only learned one new word or listened to a short English conversation, I still made progress.
Yes, I think having patience is key. On tough days, I'd remind myself of why I started in the first place. Whether it was to watch a movie without subtitles or speak to someone in English, connecting to my end goal always helped me push through.
That's a fantastic mindset. It's important to keep the bigger picture in mind, especially when motivation wanes. Another thing that often comes up in language learning is confidence. How did you both build the confidence to speak in English, especially when you were still learning?
For me, It was about shifting my mindset. I realized that people aren't judging me for making mistakes. They're just happy that I'm trying. Once I embraced the idea, I felt much more confident. I also started with small conversations with friends or online language partners, which gradually helped me build that confidence.
I love that point, Daniel. I also practiced a lot in low-pressure situations. For example, I would practice ordering food at a restaurant in English, or I'd talk to myself about my day in English. Small, everyday interactions made a big difference in boosting my confidence.
Yes, it's all about taking small steps and celebrating your progress. Confidence comes with time, and the more you speak, the more natural it becomes. Now, let's talk about something that can be a bit challenging: listening comprehension. How did you both improve your listening skills?
Listening was tricky at first, especially with native speakers speaking quickly. But I started by listening to podcasts or watching videos with subtitles. At first, I'd rely on subtitles, but over time, I tried to challenge myself to watch without them. I'd replay difficult sections until I understood.
I did something similar. I'd listen to things that matched my level of understanding and gradually moved to harder content. I also focused on listening to various accents, which helped me understand different ways people speak. And, of course, repetition is key. Listening to the same audio a few times helps reinforce what you've learned.
That's such an effective strategy, gradually increasing the difficulty level while also repeating content to improve comprehension. Variety is also important in listening practice. Different accents, speech speeds, and contexts all contribute to better overall listening skills.
Absolutely. I also found that listening to the same content multiple times helped me pick up on new details I missed the first time. It's like every time you listen, you're learning something new.
That's the beauty of listening practice. There's always something to improve. The more you listen, the more you start to recognize patterns and become familiar with common phrases and words.
Exactly. Listening is such an essential skill, and the more you expose yourself to English, the easier it becomes. Now, to wrap up today's discussion, I'd love to hear both your thoughts on language learning resources. There are so many apps, websites, and tools out there. What resources did you find the most helpful in your learning journey?
Well, I can't stress enough how useful language learning apps, like Duolingo or Memrise, were for me. They make learning vocabulary and grammar feel like a game. But what really helped me was using YouTube channels with language tips and practice exercises. I'd watch videos from native speakers about common language hacks, and that helped a lot.
I agree with Daniel on the apps. I also used Anki for flashcards to remember new words, especially for reviewing vocabulary. But I found online language exchange platforms like HelloTalk really helpful. Speaking with native speakers and getting immediate feedback was so useful in improving my confidence.
Those are excellent recommendations. There's no shortage of resources, and it's great to see how each of you found ways to integrate them into your learning routine. With so many tools at our fingertips, there's no excuse not to keep improving.
Exactly. The internet has made language learning more accessible than ever before. There are so many options, and you can find what works for you.
And remember, it's not about having the perfect resources. It's about consistency and enjoying the process.
What a great way to end today's discussion. Thanks again for sharing all of your insights, Daniel and Jacob. I hope our listeners feel motivated to keep learning and improving their English, no matter where they are in their journey.
Thank you so much for having us, Sophia.
It was awesome being here. Thanks again, Sophia.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Keep practicing, keep improving, and most importantly, keep enjoying the process. Until next time, take care and keep speaking English